It's great to be joined today by Maya Schenwar, who's editor-in-chief of Truthout and author of Locked Down, Locked Out: Why Prison Doesn't Work and How We Can Do Better. Maya, I think I'm going to try to get into this with you maybe in a different way because we know about the failure of the war on drugs. We know about the disaster that many of the individual sort of logistics of prison have been for many people. We know about the devastating effect that imprisonment has on the communities surrounding and the families of those imprisoned. So let's see if we can work backwards. Is there anything that you feel about the American prison system that is either effective, working well, any silver lining at all?
So I think that when we think about this system and when we evaluate it, as opposed to kind of critiquing its flaws, we have to see it as fundamentally flawed. So for me, this is a system that's not just got problems, but it's not working at its core. So this is a system where we see two-thirds of people coming out of prison being rearrested in 3 years. This is a system that is grounded in white supremacy that evolved out of slavery, so even its roots are rotten. It's not just that there are rotten apples on the tree. So to me, I don't really see a value in assessing redeeming characteristics in a system that we just have to fundamentally transform. Of course, there are amazing people who work within the system, just as there are amazing people within any system, even those that are fundamentally damaging to society.
What would be the most top level way that one could assess whether a system of incarceration and or rehabilitation, depending on whether you believe that that's the goal, is functioning? Would it be that which you just referred to, which is, are people after serving sentences leading lives that keep them out of prison in the future? I mean, what sort of barometer could we look at to really say, how could we tell if the system was working?
Good question. Yeah, I think that recidivism rate is a really good measure of whether the system is doing what it says it's doing, right? So the system is supposed to be quote unquote correcting people, right? It's called a correctional system and often a rehabilitative system. So if you have a system where people are simply cycling in and out, then that sort of reveals the lie in that logic. But also, I would definitely push further than that. I think that we need to look at all of the effects that prison has on both the people who are incarcerated and their communities. So we have to look at, are people being traumatized behind bars, both by the physical and sexual violence that happens during incarceration, very often perpetrated by guards, and also just the violence of being caged as a human being. There's lots and lots of research about the psychological and even physical effects that confinement has on a person and how that trauma is lasting. And also what kinds of effects that trauma has when that person is released to the wider society. We also have to look at how prison impacts communities. And this is something I focus on a lot in my book. When someone is abruptly severed from their family and community, often that person is the primary wage earner in a family. So what is that doing economically to families? What is it doing emotionally to families to have a mother or father abruptly removed from the home? How does it impact children? At this point, there are 2.7 million children who have a parent who's incarcerated, and there are 10 million children who've experienced parental incarceration in this country. So what kind of deep, lasting impacts is that having on kids? And I think just thinking about that idea of prison as a cycle, we should keep in mind, kids are impacted in ways that often actually drive them into the system eventually. Children are much more likely to be incarcerated if a parent has been incarcerated during their childhood.
There are those who would hear you talk about the recidivism rate, those who have more authoritarian tendencies, and they would
Hmm.
say, well, the statistics that Maya's presenting are right, but wouldn't a high recidivism rate at least warrant exploring whether those individuals should be imprisoned even longer or forever? And while that's not something I believe, and intuitively we can sort of understand why that doesn't make sense, what empirical data can we look at to tell us that that is not the solution?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, we need to look at ourselves in context. So the United States employs, I guess, what I would call the living death penalty, life without parole, more than almost any other country in the world. And most countries don't even have life sentences in the way that we do. We give out life sentences in this way that doesn't acknowledge that effectively we're sentencing people to death. We also just have much longer sentences than most European countries because we have these mandatory minimums, right? For drugs, for guns, for all of these different crimes, we have these rules that we impose on judges saying if a person is convicted of this crime, you need to impose this minimum sentence, very often resulting in these decades long sentences for sometimes even nonviolent crimes. In fact, Obama recently granted clemency to a number of people convicted, mostly on crack conspiracy charges, who'd been imprisoned for over a decade, and many of them for several decades. And so I think looking at ourselves in context, first of all, and saying this is an unusual way to operate a system. And if we're having the kinds of recidivism rates that we have, given that we're sentencing people to such long terms, maybe we should start thinking about the idea that prison doesn't necessarily discourage crime. In fact, some would say it's criminogenic, it causes crime. And actually, an increasing number of social scientists are saying, yeah, there's something criminogenic about prison because people go to prison and they're put in a traumatic environment. If you've ever heard the expression hurt people, put in a violent environment where there are not, positive motivators in their lives. And then they're taken out after years in this very abrupt way and put into a world that doesn't want them, right? Put into a world where they're not being supported, where it's very, very difficult for them to find jobs and housing and educational opportunities, especially if they've been incarcerated for many, many years. And in those kinds of economic circumstances, they're much more likely to turn back to activity that's been criminalized, acts that we consider crimes, just in order to survive. So I think that logic that keeping people in longer somehow removes their motivation to commit acts that we call crimes is definitely flawed. And I also think, in terms of the idea of doling out more life sentences,
Yeah.
I think at this point, fortunately, almost no one is making that argument. And part of the reason for that is actually financial, that even a number of conservatives now are looking at the criminal punishment system and saying, wait a second, we are spending so much money keeping people behind bars. In some cases, we're spending anywhere from $30,000 to $90,000 per person in prison to incarcerate people. And so every additional year you keep someone in prison, you're just putting more money in that kind of bank account for punishment when it could be going toward all kinds of other services that might actually support people in being able to survive and thrive on the outside.
Maya, in the book, you talk about how our incarceration system has directly affected your family. In the limited time we have left, for people who have not yet read the book, could you give us a sense of that experience?
Absolutely. So, for about a decade until last year, my sister was in and out of jail and prison here in Illinois, and she struggles with heroin addiction. And so, all of the offenses for which she was incarcerated were related to that addiction. They were stealing and drug possession and those types of things, all feeding into that problem. And of course, prison did not address her health problem. It actually made it worse. When she got out of jail and prison each time, she was actually more likely to return to heroin.
Hmm.
And so my family was caught in this cycle of, you know, spending a lot of time both trying to support her when she came out of prison and living with the reality of having an incarcerated family member while she was locked up, going on those visits to a prison 4 hours away and spending the whole day basically being treated like a prisoner yourself, and having that experience of watching families who've gone through this for decades and decades. You know, some of the other people in that waiting room, this had become their life. You know, that waiting room had become the the structure kind of dictating what their life looked like. And my sister struggled a lot in prison and is actually still working to recover not only from her addiction, but from the trauma she experienced behind bars. In fact, the last time she was locked up, she was pregnant and she had to go through her pregnancy and then the birth of her child while incarcerated.
Wow.
And yeah, she gave birth to her child, and within 24 hours, her baby was taken away from her, and she was led back to prison alone and had to spend months there just suffering with health problems, waiting to be reunited with her child, and knowing that even when she came out, it was going to be difficult to be reunited because that's a whole other system that punishes mothers coming out of prison with, you know, the very, very difficult process of being able to reunite with their babies. So I think that what I learned watching my sister go through this horrendous, horrendous experience was that all of the problems that prison kind of purports to solve, prison in this country is used to address poverty, homelessness, drug addiction, mental illness, illiteracy. It's not actually addressing those problems. And I didn't realize this going in. I actually thought prison might help solve my sister's drug addiction.
Mm.
But prison doesn't do that. In fact, it just erases those problems. It shoves them under the rug, right? And very often under the rug, they just fester, you know, and often they're exacerbated. And what I really think we need is a society that prioritizes addressing those problems straightforwardly, as opposed to using this devastating and sometimes torturous system to hide them, to make them seem kind of less of a problem to the rest of society that doesn't see the insides of prisons. And meanwhile, those problems are continuing and expanding and staying with us while we spend these billions and billions of dollars.
I'll tell you once again, the book is Locked Down, Locked Out, Why Prison Doesn't Work and How We Can Do Better. We've been speaking with the book's author, Maya Schenwar. Thanks for sharing your story.
Thank you so much.